This talk is about suffering and how to get rid of it. I predict we will abolish suffering throughout the living world. Our descendants will be animated by gradients of genetically pre-programmed well-being that are orders of magnitude richer than today's peak experiences. First, I'm going to outline why it's technically feasible to abolish the biological substrates of any kind of unpleasant experience, psychological pain as well as physical pain. Secondly, I'm going to argue for the overriding moral urgency of the abolitionist project, whether or not one is any kind of ethical utilitarian. Thirdly, I'm going to argue why a revolution in biotechnology means it's going to happen, albeit not nearly as fast as it should. Okay, 1. Why it is technically feasible. Sadly, what won't abolish suffering, or at least not on its own, is socio-economic reform, or exponential economic growth, or technological progress in the usual sense, or any of the traditional panaceas for solving the world's ills. Improving the external environment is admirable and important, but such improvement can't recalibrate our hedonic treadmill above a genetically constrained ceiling. Twin studies confirm there is a partially heritable set point of well-being, or ill-being, around which we all tend to fluctuate over the course of a lifetime. This set point varies between individuals. It's possible to lower our hedonic set point by inflicting prolonged uncontrolled stress, but even this reset is not as easy as it sounds. Suicide rates typically tend to go down in wartime, and 6 months after a quadriplegia-inducing accident, studies suggest that we are typically neither more nor less unhappy than we were before the catastrophic event. Unfortunately, attempts to build an ideal society can't overcome this biological ceiling, whether utopias of the left or right, free market or socialist, religious or secular, futuristic, high-tech, or simply cultivating one's garden. Even if everything that traditional futurists have asked for is delivered, eternal youth, unlimited material wealth, morphological freedom, superintelligence, immersive VR, molecular nanotechnology, etc., there is no evidence that our subjective quality of life would on average significantly surpass the quality of life of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, or a New Guinea tribesman today, in the absence of reward pathway enrichment. This claim is difficult to prove in the absence of sophisticated neuroscanning, but objective indices of psychological distress, e.g. suicide rates, bear it out. Unenhanced humans will still be prey to the spectrum of Darwinian emotions, ranging from terrible suffering to petty disappointments and frustrations, sadness, anxiety, jealousy, existential angst. Their biology is part of what it means to be human. Subjectively unpleasant states of consciousness exist because they were genetically adaptive. Each of our core emotions had a distinct signalling role in our evolutionary past. They tended to promote behaviours which enhanced the inclusive fitness of our genes in the ancestral environment. So if manipulating our external environment alone can never abolish suffering malaise, what does technically work? Here are 3 scenarios in ascending order of sociological plausibility. A. Wireheading. B. Utopian designer drugs. C. Genetic engineering and, what I want to focus on, the impending reproductive revolution of designer babies. A. Recall wireheading is direct stimulation of the pleasure centres of the brain via implanted electrodes. Intracranial self-stimulation shows no physiological or subjective tolerance, i.e. it's just as rewarding after 2 days as it is after 2 minutes. Wireheading doesn't harm others, it has a small ecological footprint, it banishes psychological and physical pain, and arguably it's a lot less offensive to human dignity than having sex. Admittedly, lifelong wireheading sounds an appealing prospect only to a handful of severe depressives, but what are the technical arguments against its adoption? Well, wireheading is not an evolutionarily stable solution. There would be selection pressure against its widespread adoption. Wireheading doesn't promote nurturing behaviour. Wireheads, whether human or non-human, don't want to raise baby wireheads. Uniform, indiscriminate bliss in the guise of wireheading or its equivalents would effectively bring the human experiment to an end, at least if it were adopted globally. Direct neurostimulation of the reward centres destroys informational sensitivity to environmental stimuli. So assuming we want to be smart and become smarter, we have a choice. Intelligent agents can have a motivational structure based on gradients of ill-being, characteristic of some lifelong depressives today, or intelligent agents can have our current typical mixture of pleasures and pains, Or alternatively, we could have an informational economy of mind based entirely on adaptive gradients of cerebral bliss, which is what I'm going to argue for. Actually, this dismissal of warheading may be too quick. In the far future, one can't rule out offloading everything unpleasant or mundane onto inorganic supercomputers, prostheses and robots while we enjoy uniform orgasmic bliss. Or maybe not orgasmic bliss, possibly some other family of ideal states that simply couldn't be improved upon. But that's speculative. Whatever our ultimate destination, it would be more prudent, I think, to aim for both super happiness and super intelligence, at least until we understand the full implications of what we are doing. There isn't a moral urgency to maximizing super happiness in the same way as there is to abolishing suffering. It's worth noting that the offloading option assumes that inorganic computers, prostheses and robots don't, or at least needn't, experience subjective phenomenal pain even if their functional architecture allows them to avoid and respond to noxious stimuli. This absence of inorganic suffering is relatively uncontroversial with existing computers. Switching off one's PC doesn't have ethical implications, and a silicon robot can be programmed to avoid corrosive acids without experiencing agony if it's damaged. It's debatable whether any computational system with a classical von Neumann architecture will ever be interestingly conscious. I'm sceptical, but either way, it doesn't affect the offloading option unless one argues that the subjective texture of suffering is functionally essential to any system capable of avoiding harmful stimuli. B. The second technical option for eradicating suffering is futuristic designer drugs. In an era of mature post-genomic medicine, would it be possible rationally to design truly ideal pleasure drugs that deliver lifelong, high-functioning well-being without unacceptable side effects? Ideal pleasure drugs here is just a piece of shorthand. Such drugs can in principle embrace cerebral, empathetic, aesthetic and perhaps spiritual well-being, and not just hedonistic pleasure in the usual one-dimensional and amoral sense. We're not talking here about recreational euphoriants, which simply activate the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain, nor the shallow opiatic contentment of a brave new world, nor drugs that induce euphoric mania with its uncontrolled excitement, loss of critical insight, grandiosity and flight of ideas. Can we develop true wonder drugs that deliver sublime well-being on a sustainable basis, recalibrating the hedonic treadmill to ensure a high quality of life for everyone? A lot of people recoil from the word drugs, which is understandable given today's noxious street drugs and their uninspiring medical counterparts. Yet even academics and intellectuals in our society typically take the prototypical dumb drug, ethyl alcohol. If it's socially acceptable to take a drug that makes you temporarily happy and stupid, then why not rationally design drugs to make people perpetually happier and smarter? Presumably, in order to limit abuse potential, one would want any ideal pleasure drug to be akin, in one limited but important sense, to nicotine, where the smoker's brain finally calibrates its optimal level. There is no uncontrolled dose escalation. There are, of course, all kinds of pitfalls to drug-based solutions. Technically, I think these pitfalls can be overcome. I won't try to show this here. But there is a deeper issue. If there weren't something fundamentally wrong, or at least fundamentally inadequate, with our existing natural state of consciousness bequeathed by evolution, then we wouldn't be so keen to change it. Even when it's not unpleasant, everyday consciousness is mediocre compared to what we call peak experiences. Ordinary everyday consciousness was presumably adaptive, in the sense it helped our genes leave more copies of themselves on the African savannah, but why keep it as our default state indefinitely? Why not change human nature by quite literally repairing our genetic code? Again, this dismissal of pharmacological solutions may be too quick. Arguably, utopian designer drugs may always be useful for the fine-grained and readily reversible control of consciousness, and I think designer drugs will be an indispensable tool to explore the disparate varieties of conscious mind. But wouldn't it be better if we were all born with a genetic predisposition to psychological superhealth rather than needing chronic self-medication? Does even the most ardent abolitionist propose to give cocktails of drugs to all children from birth, and then to take such drug cocktails for the rest of our lives? So thirdly, there are genetic solutions, embracing both somatic and germline therapy. By way of context, Today there is a minority of people who are always depressed or dysthymic, albeit to varying degrees. Studies with mono and dizygotic twins confirm there is a high degree of genetic loading for depression. Conversely, there are some people who are temperamentally optimistic. Beyond the optimists, there is a very small minority of people who are what psychiatrists call hyperthymic. Hyperthymic people aren't manic or bipolar, but by contemporary standards they are always exceedingly happy, albeit sometimes happier than others. Hyperthymic people respond appropriately and adaptively to their environment. Indeed, they are characteristically energetic, productive and creative. Even when they are blissful, they aren't blissed out. Now what if, as a whole civilization, we were to opt to become genetically hyperthymic, to adopt a motivational system driven entirely by adaptive gradients of well-being? More radically, as the genetic basis of hedonic tone is understood, might we opt to add multiple extra copies of hyperthymia-promoting genes, allelic combinations, and their regulatory promoters, not abolishing homeostasis and the hedonic treadmill, but shifting our hedonic set point to a vastly higher level? 3 points here. First, this genetic recalibration might seem to be endorsing another kind of uniformity, but it's worth recording that happier people, and especially hyperdopaminergic people, are typically responsive to a broader range of potentially rewarding stimuli than depressives. They engage in more exploratory behaviour. This makes getting stuck in a suboptimal rut less likely, both for the enhanced individual and society as a whole. Secondly, universal hyperthymia might sound like a gigantic experiment, and in a sense of course it is, but all sexual reproduction is an experiment. We play genetic roulette, shuffling our genes and then throwing the genetic dice. Most of us flinch from the word eugenics, but that's what we're effectively practicing, crudely and incompetently, when we choose our prospective mates. The difference is that within the next few decades, prospective parents will be able to act progressively more rationally and responsibly in their reproductive decisions. Pre-implantation diagnosis is going to become routine, artificial wombs will release us from the constraints of the human birth canal, and a revolution in reproductive medicine will begin to replace the old Darwinian lottery. The question is not whether a reproductive revolution is coming, but rather what kinds of being and what kinds of consciousness do we want to create. Thirdly, isn't this reproductive revolution going to be the prerogative of rich elites in the West? Probably not for long. Compare the brief lag between the introduction of, say, mobile phones and their worldwide adoption with a 50-year time lag between the introduction and worldwide adoption of radio, and the 20-year lag between the introduction and worldwide penetration of television. The time lag between the initial introduction and global acceptance of new technologies is shrinking rapidly. So, of course, is the price. Anyway, one of the advantages of genetically recalibrating the hedonic treadmill rather than abolishing it altogether, at least for the foreseeable future, is that the functional analogues of pain, anxiety, guilt and even depression can be preserved without their nasty raw feels as we understand them today. We can retain the functional analogues of discontent, arguably the motor of progress, and retain the discernment and critical insight lacking in the euphorically manic. Even if hedonic tone is massively enriched, and even if our reward centres are physically and functionally amplified, then it's still possible in principle to conserve much of our existing preference architecture. If you prefer Mozart to Beethoven, or philosophy to Pushkin, then you can still retain this preference ranking, even if your hedonic tone is hugely enriched. Now personally, I think it would be better if our preference architecture were radically changed, and we pursued, please pardon the jargon, a re-encephalization of emotion. Evolution by natural selection has left us strongly predisposed to form all manner of dysfunctional preferences that harm both ourselves and others for the benefit of our genes. Recall Genghis Khan, quote, "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather into your bosom his wives and daughters." End quote.